Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week, we talk with Ladan Boroumand, a human rights activist from Iran, and she's going to tell us why it is that the Iranian people are rejecting that toxic stew of state Islam and Marxist ideology. Check it out. Ladan, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
There is so much to talk about. I spent the last week watching some of your speeches and reading articles that you've published, and I've learned so much about what's going on internally in Iran amongst the people and the ideology of the Islamic State. And I want to get into all of that, but if we could just start with a basic biography of who you're associated with and what work you're focused on right now.
I'm a senior fellow right now at a foundation that my sister and I created in memory of our father, Ladan Boroumand, a foundation or center for human rights in Iran. This is an organization we created in 2001. And its main objective is to document and tell the story of all the people whose lives were taken by the Islamic Republic of Iran. No matter who they were, no matter what they thought, no matter their nationality, religions, or even the crimes that they were accused of. Because the Islamic Republic not only kills people outside the country by exploding bombs, but also their judicial system is basically based on the systematic denial of due process of law. So even if someone is accused of a crime, a real crime, theft or murder, they don't get the right of defense. And therefore, you never know if they are really guilty or not. So we consider them victims.
You have a project that means hope in Farsi?
Yes, this is the name of the memorial.
Yeah.
So this is an online memorial where we tell the story of each individual, both in English and in Farsi. So it's really labor intensive. And we explain how many human rights for each case have been violated. So the Farsi section targets the Iranian and wants to teach them due process, why it matters, why it's important, and what are their human rights. The English section is bearing witness so that the world could see what the Islamic Republic is doing to its own people and to people around the world.
You know, Joseph Stalin, the brutal dictator, supposedly said that one death is a tragedy and a million deaths is a statistic. And I thought of that when I was looking at your website because you put a face and a story and the family that's devastated behind every one of these individual atrocities. And I think it's a very powerful way to get people to pay attention.
Yes.
To abstract things like rule of law, like what is that all about?
Exactly. And so they will see at each level, at each stage of the arrest, the interrogation, what are the human rights that are violated. And in a way, what we do also, when the trial of strength is so unfavorable to the victims, becoming apathetic, depressed, and doing nothing becomes a sort of you have no other choice.
Yeah.
This truth-telling platform that we provide to the families, it's a way also of transforming them from a passive victim into an active militant for rights and justice. So it has also a therapeutic aspect to it, in addition to its educational aspect.
I'm jumping ahead, but I think it's relevant to this. Our social media platforms, particularly encrypted ones, are they widely used in Iran, or has the regime tried to stifle that?
Oh, we have been 6 or 7 months after we went public, we published the website. We were filtered. But Iranians are very technologically savvy, and those who are interested can reach us. We have a form that is very secure, so family members can send us their information and their stories through a form that could be anonymous. We have a database that is designed for human rights violation analysis. So, as you said, we try to combine the storytelling and the statistical aspect of it for the future, for transitional justice and, for accountability.
Yeah. Well, let's take a step back and get into your personal story, because I read this morning that you were on the ground during the revolution in 1979. But talk a little bit about your family upbringing and your studies in Paris, and how you got to this position of defending the rule of law and liberal democracy.
Our father was a pro-democracy militant under the Shah. So he was in the liberal opposition to the Shah, and a staunch Mossadegh lover. The prime minister who was dismissed or pushed aside by a coup supported by Great Britain and the United States. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes of U.S. foreign policy at the time. So we grew up in a family critical towards what was going on, but rationally critical and very supportive of freedom and liberty. When the revolution happened, obviously, at the beginning, my father was really favorable to change, but they wanted constitutional reform and that the king would not govern but only reign, which is like the Queen of England, and but things turned otherwise. So during the revolutionary transition, the nationalist liberal opposition that were pro-Mossadegh split on either are we supporting Khomeini or are we not supporting. And one of its leaders was Dr. Shapur Bakhtiar, who was a social democrat who had spent 6 years in prison during the Shah. And he said, no, a religious tyranny is worse than a secular dictatorship. We have the opportunity, the Shah is giving us the opportunity to reform the constitution, to democratize, to start free elections. So he accepted the offer by the Shah to become the transitional prime minister. My father rallied him. And obviously Khomeini had other plans for Iran, and he tricked the population with revolutionary discourses. And Bakhtiar ruled for 37 days in Iran, and these are the only 37 days where the press was free, political parties were free, and people, instead of organizing, he was really conjuring them, organize in political parties, start your labor unions, let's organize the elections, and if the Ayatollah wants to part in this, he can organize and participate in the elections. But obviously the Ayatollah had another plan. For him, he was chosen by God. So either people will accept him or they wouldn't accept him. He was not going to run for elections.
Yeah.
And so Dr. Bakhtiar his government was toppled in February 11th, and he went into hiding. My father at the time was in Paris. He had been doing some trying to establish communication lines between the Ayatollah and Dr. Bakhtiar. And I was a student in Paris at the time, but during the revolutionary 3-4 weeks, I mean, a week after Khomeini went back to Iran, I went back to Iran working with a French television. as a translator at the time. So this allowed me, because as a very young female student, I couldn't go around and do my studies of the revolution. So I thought that is a good cover for me to go around. So I helped them, but at the same time, I started to interview different social categories about, because in another, I have to open this parenthesis, during the stay of Khomeini in Paris, there, I don't know if you remember the first president of the Islamic Republic. His name was Bani Sadr. And he was also, before becoming a partisan of Khomeini, he was a pro-Mossadegh militant. So I knew him. He was a friend of my father. And he had a library. In this library, I found Khomeini's political program, his Mein Kampf, basically. When I read it, I was, completely horrified.
Because up until this point, you were vaguely sympathetic to
I was,
to replacing
my point was, I didn't understand why Khomeini and Bakhtiar couldn't reach a consensus if both wanted democracy. I didn't understand.
Yeah.
And 3 weeks before Khomeini left Paris, I found this book and I read it, and I asked Bani Sadr, but Mr. Bani Sadr, this guy doesn't want democracy. This is a tyranny. He is, Bani Sadr said, no, Mr. Khomeini has changed. He has evolved. Maybe you're younger than me, but in the vocabulary of 1968, young people's revolts, evolving was very fashionable. And I thought, the guy is nearly 80 years old. The vocabulary of 1968 couldn't apply to him. I asked Khomeini, I asked Bani Sadr, let us ask the Ayatollah if he is interested, what is this? And if he has changed his opinion about the future of Iran. And so Bani Sadr said, okay. And we were a bunch of young people translating foreign press for Khomeini at the time. And I wrote 13 questions, very handwritten, about the parliament, the issue of representation, the vote, and all of this. And we handed over to Khomeini in our last meeting, and his son-in-law came out and handed back my questions to me and said, the Ayatollah is not responding to these questions. I made a scandal. I said, why? He said, this is not the right time for that. I was very young, inexperienced, and also ignorant to some extent. And I thought, this doesn't sound right. And that was the end of my relationship with Mr. Bani Sadr. I came out. What I regret at the time is that maybe because there were a lot of press at the time in this vicinity of Khomeini's residence in the outskirts of Paris, and I thought maybe I should have gone to the media and talked about this issue. But I was too shy.
Yeah.
You are too young, too shy.
So how old were you at this point? How old were you?
I was 22.
Yeah.
That's not much for fighting such a fight alone. But then I went to, Khomeini went to Iran, went back, and I went back a week later, and the following 48 or 76 hours were the time where the government of Dr. Bakhtiar was toppled.
Yeah.
And I was walking in the streets of Iran, and what I learned from this experience is that, I knew what Khomeini had in mind. And I was seeing what people were fantasizing about what Khomeini had in mind. The questionnaires I had for teachers, for workers in the factories, people were describing what would look like a representative democracy. And they were saying, the Imam will bring us this. But I knew the Imam had something else. So I realized that in popular movements, it's not what every single individual participant has in mind that will be the outcome. The outcome is what the leadership has in
Yeah.
mind, and the way you allow the leadership, the freedom you give to the leadership. This was a big lesson I learned from that experience.
Was he a charismatic leader that had the ability to communicate in a way that everyone could just fill in the blanks
Yes.
based on their values and not his?
Yes. So one of the major issues of Iran at the time was the lack of and the weakness of the political culture of the elite.
Yeah.
You know, the intelligentsia was very much under the influence of Marxism-Leninism, and if you remember, in Marxist worldview, politics is a superstructure.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. Laws and government and constitution don't matters. And the main leaders were engineers, not lawyers, you know. So basically, they fell into the trap very easily. And Khomeini would say it's freedom within the framework of Islam. But what Islam he was talking about, you know? So he didn't lie to people, but he didn't spell out what he wanted to say.
Well, he was using, as I understand it, he was using the word Islam in a radically different way than perhaps people were hearing it.
Yes.
And I'd love to get into that, because this toxic mix of political Islam and sort of radical Marxist revolutionary philosophy, this was a new thing. This is where he was coming from. Explain all of that, because I suspect most of my viewers don't know the difference between political Islam and religious Islam.
Yes. First of all, let's remember, or let's say that in traditional Shiism, it's a little bit like Christianity, a little bit, which means that the big ayatollahs are supposed not to meddle in politics, because in politics there is corruption, and in order to save religion, you have to wait until the 12th Imam comes back at the end of the time. This was the main.
So strict separation. We
not strict, because they have the Sharia. And the Sharia was a problem for the clergy. And I think it was on this that Khomeini was able to mobilize part of the traditional clergy to gain their support, because society was modernizing in Iran. And so the traditional clergy were a little bit worried, because their relationship with this corpus of traditional laws and regulation was not a critical approach of their own corpus. So they were watching the society modernizing, and they had no response for how to reconcile modernity and religion. So there was a malaise that had started from the beginning of the 20th century, and it was continuing. And the traditional religious elite had no response for it. In the meantime, many young people in the 60s were attracted to communism. And some part of the religious groups had thought, we need to engage with these people. And as they were engaging with these people, they adopted a lot of their paradigms. And that's why the Shah at the beginning.
You mentioned Che Guevara was very cool, and he was one of their intellectual or revolutionary heroes.
Yes, Che Guevara, but also Fanon, all these people, the third world leftist people, and we had some secular intellectuals who adopted all the intellectual structure of Marxism, but they turned it into, they gave it Islamic names, So even the word Hezbollah, the political word Hezbollah, was coined by a secular intellectual. Khomeini adopted it in a way. And the Shah at the beginning let these people work, whereas people like Bakhtiar were in prison, liberal Democrats, and they were not allowed to get even near the university. The underground literature of the Soviet Union was nourishing the generation, and the Shah thought maybe this Islamic approach, modernization, could neutralize or stop the spread of communism among the young people. But what he did realize very late is that basically we had a new phenomenon that he called Marxist Islamist. And he was right. But at the time, even the opposition thought he's exaggerating. So basically, Khomeini could rally these leftist revolutionaries, part of the traditionalists who were worried about the orientation of society in its modernization, and also some of the nationalists who thought, oh, a mullah is not important. What he's doing is fantastic because he's unifying the nation against the Shah and American imperialism. So and the worst, I think our curse was that the Soviet Union went behind the Ayatollah.
Yeah.
And without the support of the Soviet Union, I think he couldn't go on and do what he did, because the society, this consensus of the society that basically lasted until August 1979 started rapidly to unravel. And had it not been for the hostage taking, which was the symbolic act that signified publicly to the world the change of alliance of the new regime that went under the umbrella protection of the Soviet Union, did it all, because the whole communist cells and intelligentsia and activists went behind Khomeini, and that guaranteed the survival, the strengthening of the regime and its survival.
You know, that history answered a question that I've struggled with in an American context. There are elements on the far left that are very sympathetic to the Iranian regime, and part of it is just being anti-Trump, and whatever Trump says, they're on the opposite side of that. But I've never been able to fully understand the tolerance for human rights abuses, particularly the treatment of women and homosexuals and artists and poets and all of these things that you document. But I think it must go back to the Marxist element in this experiment. That has to work.
Yes,
somehow, somewhere.
Yes, absolutely. During the revolutionary period, many young communist militant women were questioning the fact that, the veil, Khomeini's what will happen to women, and all the time they were hearing, but the anti-imperialist struggle and character of Khomeini's regime is more important than your rights as individual female. And I was not really surprised that the Iranian communists somehow went behind the regime, because basically it was the same totalitarian mindset.
Yeah.
So they were closer to the Ayatollah than to Dr. Bakhtiar in a way, even though many of them got killed afterward. But if you have this worldview, naturally you will be drawn to to a worldview that is very similar to yours. And both the communists and Khomeini's, their essence is the fight against individual rights.
Yeah.
And so that was an objective alliance, more than objective alliance. I think it was a sort of really a close ideological affinity.
Yeah, the individual doesn't matter. It's
No.
the collective.
Yes.
It's the
And America, and this is very interesting, because of the background of the coup in Iran, obviously the United States was suspect in a way, but at the same time, the enmity with the United States is not their policy, is not what they did, it's their very essence.
Yeah.
You know, as a democratic body politic, that is the problem. And even recently, Khamenei, when talking after the assassination of Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guards one of the Revolutionary Guard leaders, he said, America is our enemy by nature. He didn't say by policy. And I think this is a nuance that the left the democratic left, not the totalitarian left, in the West should understand. And I have said it time and again, even in the trial of Dr. Bakhtiar in Paris, because we didn't say the rest of the story. Dr. Bakhtiar left Iran in August 1979 clandestinely, joined my father in Paris, stayed in our house for a while, and then they launched a new opposition pro-democracy group. And in 1991, they were both assassinated by the Islamic Republic agents in France.
Your father was stabbed to death outside of his apartment.
Yes, in April
in
Paris, April 1991, and Dr. Bakhtiar was stabbed to death in his home under the nose of the French police that was guarding him, which was very suspicious, in August 1991. And some of them, because the public opinion in France was so scandalized by the very suspicious behavior of the French government, they had to negotiate with the Iranians probably to get one of the murderers of Dr. Bakhtiar. So there was a trial. And in this trial, I told them, coming several thousand kilometers, stabbing a 76 years old man who has no means of doing anything right now and is not a danger to the Islamic Republic, has a meaning. What they have been killing in this person is your democracy, is the idea of democracy, is not a real threat to the Islamic Republic. And that the Western policymakers and public opinion had difficulty to understand until the day that Islamism became a problem within their own societies.
Yeah.
It's always like this with democracies. They understand but very late, and they react but after many people have lost their lives. It's the same with the Second World War.
Yeah, and this very personal experience that you went through sort of filled in some blanks for you about the contradiction sometimes between Western democracies who say that they're for human rights, individual rights, autonomous, people are free, versus the needs of the nation, nationalism, and
yes.
that contradiction. And I think every modern democracy, including our own, struggles with that.
Yes.
Potentially contradiction, that there's an aspiration, and I think the United States was very much built on that aspirational value that each individual matters and that each individual has control, but we definitely don't always get it right. But in France, in that instance, they went with expedient economic needs, I assume primarily oil, with Iran to look the other way.
Yes, and
at best look the other way.
I think that has been also American policy for a long time, because as you said, my main problem then that became a sort of intellectual issue, and I wanted to figure it out in order to better understand democracy, the West, nation states, the concept of sovereignty, was how come these political entities who are ruled by democratic principles within behave in a completely different manner and in their interaction with other polities, which brings to the question the colonialism and imperialism. And I did these studies. I mean, that's a long story of my academic work on the French Revolution and the terror. So my understanding of what has happened in the West is that what we thought were democracies before the World War II were national parliamentarism. So, yes, every individual citizen has rights and dignity, but you don't know why. Is it because they are the individuation of the nation, or is it because they are individual and they have natural inherent rights? And I'm always interested, and the French during the revolution, they tried to figure this out, and they put the notion of natural rights in their constitution. And that created such a clash with their principle of sovereignty and nationhood that at the end of the revolution, after the terror, they put it out.
Yeah.
They put it out, and all the European constitutions had no reference to human rights, universal human rights, until after the World War II. This is when human rights was reintroduced to constitutional corpus of Western polities. Americans were more clever. They referred to natural rights for their independence, but they didn't put it in their constitution. There were amendments, and there were citizens' rights. And that's why perhaps the idea of outlaws survived in the political tradition of the United States until even Dick Cheney mentioned it. But then it created a crisis. But this is not...
Well, I think it's relevant, and I want to. We were talking before we went live. You would call yourself a social democrat, and I would call myself a libertarian. And I think when you use the phrase liberal democracy, conservatives and even some libertarians might talk about constitutional republicanism, meaning the autonomous individual is the basis of society, that the freedom of speech and the right to due process and essentially the right to live your own life as you see fit, as long as you don't hurt people or take their stuff. That to me is the opportunity for all of us that are looking to defend human rights and find a way that we can all get along despite of our religious or ethnic or economic differences. And the enemy, and if we accept the right-left thing, the enemy are authoritarians, no matter how they've framed that. You mentioned that Khomeini's personal book was his Mein Kampf.
Yes.
And I personally don't think that violent Marxists and violent Nazis, I don't find a fundamental difference between those ideologies, because they're anti-human, they're violent, and the state comes before the individual. So I think there's common ground here, even though we might identify on who we might vote for in the next election.
Yes, there is a fundamental common ground. If we accept that individuals have rights by nature, which is a postulate, and the state's power, or anyone's power, it could be also the market powers, has a red line, which are these inherent rights. Then we are playing on the same court, basically.
Yeah.
And then afterward, our differences are matter of discussion, and to some people, individuals can manage alone. To some, I think the state has a role, because we don't have the same gifts, and some of us are not as clever as the others, and so solidarity within the society is important if we don't want to lose part of our citizenry to fascism, basically.
And those are policy differences.
Yes, they are not fundamental
as
differences.
opposed to fundamental differences.
Yes.
And once we fix the big problem, I'd love to have you back on, and we'll argue about the small problems.
Yes, exactly.
But I want to get back to, like your core thesis, which is the crisis of legitimacy with the current Islamic regime. And I would just add one more point on that question of liberal democracy. The current supreme leader, how do you pronounce Khomeini, and some of us who are naive would confuse Khomeini and Khamenei. But and I don't know if it was in response to Trump or if it was previous, but he says specifically that and maybe it's in the context of what he refers to as American Islam, that the values in the Declaration of Independence and the values personified by George Washington, that's the enemy. And what he's talking about is the American aspiration towards individual autonomy and freedom and rule of law and all these things that we're talking about. So it is explicitly that idea of the collective versus the idea of the individual.
Yes, exactly. Well, the worldview, the official worldview of the Iranian regime is that human beings are defined by their obligations, defined by God, defined by the man who has been designated by God as the leader of society. So basically, and this is where Khomeini become even the founder of not Khomeini, become even within the Islamic tradition kind of a heretic, because Islam, like Christianity and Judaism, are basically founded on God's transcendence and man's freedom, because man must choose a religion or the right path, and then he is accountable to God after death. The way Khomeini and after him the depraved ideology of the regime is defining is that there is no choice, basically, and if with the Abrahamic religions you reject choice, you are destroying these religions. It doesn't mean anything. Then you are in another worldview. So that's why Western culture and as its leadership, the United States, represent the arch enemy and the great Satan, because they are based on man's autonomy, his right to decide for his life, his rights to seek right and wrong and understand. And this is what it doesn't exist in the Islamic Republic of Iran.
So the Iranian people, at least the coalition that had gathered around Khomeini, had all of these aspirations for what this new government would look like, and he almost immediately started executing people and imposing very strict limitations, particularly on women. He was killing the artists and poets and anybody that represented that individualism and would question that authority. But on the economic side, he was a actual socialist, so he nationalized industry, and that, in my mind, that may be equally the Achilles heel of this regime, because, as you say, socialism doesn't deliver economically.
Yes.
So let's fast forward, because that, like, everybody, not everybody, but people are immediately disappointed and say, we didn't sign up for this. But he built a new coalition through violence, essentially.
Yes, he did several things. First of all, the first thing he did, he promised the poor people free housing, free water and electricity. I mean, his populism was unlimited. And in that way, he mobilized a big segment of society that was completely apolitical before. And he used this alliance to neutralize the elite who had been his first supporters. That's what he did. And he, as you say, he started to kill people and impose harsh constraints. You know, in one of his speeches, he says, even in your bedroom, you're not free. And they started to implement this. So part of the proto-Marxist Islamic young people who were not necessarily very keen on this kind of stuff were so happy that capitalism was attacked that they went along with it. And this lasted until the first 10 years of the regime. But then communism collapsed. And all these people started to, their worldview collapsed. And they started, and
with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yes. You know, and they started to think, because then this complete collapse of communism and this ideology brought them to question their alliance with Khomeini.
Yeah.
And he lost these people, the regime lost these young communists to human rights and democracy when the human rights and democracy became very fashionable even among those who were leftists before. I mean, I remember when I was young in Paris at the university, talking about human rights, it would be very bourgeois. These were bourgeois rights, individual rights, right? And then in the 80s, late 80s and early 1990s, all of these people became human rights activists, you know?
Yeah.
So these people, that was a big loss for Khomeini's regime. So what remained were those who were, I was always saying, had more fascistic view of the body politic, and that the alliance between fascism and communism under the umbrella of Khomeini had made this system very strong. So those who remained were those who were not necessarily for socialism, but they were for the strong, the absolute power of the leader, the obligation to accept whatever the leader said, you know. And so these people, they started a sort of privatization of the economy, but they didn't do it under the rule of law. They just divided between themselves. And so they started to create side of mafia type of economic, political, military units. And the current complete catastrophic economic situation of Iran is due to this kind of proto-fascistic, I don't know how to call it, because it's not even capitalism.
Yeah, it's
it's a mafia,
black market mob.
Mafia type of economy.
Explain, so people get a sense for just how desperate the economic situation is for an average Iranian. How do they live today?
You know, we are a pauperizing people. The value of the Iranian rial has lost. In 1979, the $1 was 70 rials, and now it's 130,000 rials, $1.
So not quite Venezuelan hyperinflation, but pretty
bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Horrible. So your currency, particularly for people that hold their wealth in currency, which tends to be poor and middle class people, it's devastating.
Yes.
They've lost everything.
Yes.
Yeah. And is that you talk about the crisis of legitimacy of the Islamic Republic? What What is that?
So, every time there is an uprising in and the regime suppress it, people think, okay, the regime is strong. What they don't understand is each suppressed uprising leads to a much more fundamental dissidence from the regime. And you don't see it, but you will see it 10 years later. So basically what has happened in after the death of Khomeini and the collapse of the regime, the communism, many of these leftists started to question the validity of Khomeini's religious theory. And from this effort came out a new religious reformed ideology that is a good news for the future of Iran, but not only the future of Iran, I think the future of Muslim countries as well, because for the first time in the history of the Islamic theology, some people started to question the very validity of the Sharia as a law corpus, the nature of the divine message through the Prophet Muhammad, and what must be kept out of it, what must be kept, and what must we must leave out. So, and they have been massively inspired by Christian theology. Somehow the regime, as the society, people are becoming, people are much less practicing than before the revolution, and the regime knows that. So what they started to look is how Christians have been fighting against secularization. So they started to communicate with Christian theologians. They started to establish institute for the study of Christianity under the illusion that, okay, let's see what they have done to counter secularism or people who don't believe anymore and things like this. But then they started to become more familiar with profound Christian theology. And this inspired many of the mullahs who started to question their own theology. So these are the positive side effects of the regime. And I think if the Islamic Republic collapses, we will have a massive religious transformation in Iran. And another reaction of the population that also stresses and emphasizes the crisis of legitimacy is that people are converting to Christianity. And, in 1979, under the mild regime of the Shah, there were Christian active in Iran. They were not they were not afraid for their lives. English Christian. We had Catholic. I went to a Catholic school, French school. They were there. And some people were converting. They were, Muslim background convert to Christianity in 1979 were around 500, and now it's difficult to estimate because we have house churches, clandestine house churches, but the estimate vary between 300,000 and 1 million.
Wow.
Imagine these people were all these, this is mostly evangelicals who are very active, have TV, and the people come outside, go to Georgia or to Turkey for baptism, and they go back, and so these are lower middle class that are joining. The upper middle class are becoming agnostic, atheistics, very suspicious of every religion, but also Zoroastrianism is a fantasy of the young generation who wants to revive their Iranian character as opposed to a religion brought by war and by Arabs. So they go back to the religion of Iran before Islam, which was Zoroastrianism, that has interesting also doctrinal aspects. Baha'ism, I think, is developing, which is a dissident religion from Islam, where in the 19th century, some Muslims thought they need serious doctrinal reformation, and they were blocked. So they created a new religion that is also a religion that advocates the complete separation of church and state. So the common trait between all these religious and cultural dissidents is an insistence on the separation of religion and state, which is for me the prerequisite for the establishment of democracy in any country.
Is it? I think you write this. It's also it's a backlash against the violent authoritarianism of state Islam, and I use the phrase American Islam, which I don't suspect anyone understands what that means, and I only know that from reading your stuff. But it's you could otherwise refer to that as merciful Islam. And isn't that the attraction of Christianity as well? Is that this is not a violent ideology. This is a way to live your own life and to hold yourself accountable.
Exactly. And American Islam, from day one, Khomeini labeled the man from whom he had his religious accreditation, basically, who was a much more important Ayatollah than he was. His name was Ayatollah Shariat Madari, and he was staunchly against whatever Khomeini was doing, although he supported the revolutionary movement towards reform and even a republic. When the revolutionary tribunals started to kill people, he staunchly opposed it, and the concept of the guardianship of the theologian, which reduces every citizen into the status of a minor, he also rose against that in the name of human free will and in the name of Islam. And Khomeini labeled his brand of Islam American Islam, which was the traditional Islam in Iran. And he was defrocked and put under house arrest and really persecuted. So Khomeini has always, whoever refers to his own mind and free will and reason to oppose him has something American.
Yeah.
So it's a very big compliment to the United States to embody democratic values.
We probably need to live up to that.
Yes, you do.
Is this the same cleric that was on Telegram?
No.
Tell that story.
Yes. So to tell this story, so some of these revolutionary young clerics who supported Khomeini, they started to question, and they were bolder than the traditional, the one Khomeini defrocked, because they understood that, first of all, they are losing the societies, and we have questions. I mean, I wouldn't accept the veil anymore, and before I would respect someone who has the veil. Now I even don't respect that person, because I think, what do you mean? Why my hair should be hidden? Why my body is the source of sin for a man? Why the man should not control his gaze? All are these very important questions, and it goes with cutting off hands, lex talionis, all of this, and they cannot avoid this issue. So they took up the challenge, and they started to deconstruct it. And what they are coming up, and I found intellectually interesting, is that each generation of Muslim has understood and interpreted the Quran based on the knowledge of its time. And this corpus of Sharia law that we have inherited from different centuries are basically founded on Greek worldview, because at the time the science was Greek. And now our understanding of the world, of nature, has changed. So the way we will approach the Quranic message is based on our contemporary understanding of justice, of nature, of man, of biology, of evolution, or all of this. And so basically what they are doing, they are throwing out the whole Sharia stuff, and they are keeping only the spiritual aspect of the prophetic message. So it sounds very revolutionary, but the way the regime is reacting to is saying secularism is spreading in theological seminaries, it means that these ideas are making their way into the religious seminaries within Iran. And you called American Islam or merciful Islam. The merciful Islam is exactly this, is an Islam that is based on our contemporary understanding of world, nature, man, and sciences and everything, and has a spiritual interpretation of the Quran. Khamenei and his clique labeled this also American Islam again, but there are this mullah, the Telegram mullah, who took it up. He was inside the country and started very fiery sermons based on this, attacking violent Islam. He had 2 million followers on Telegram. You know, of course, he has been defrocked.
Yeah.
He continues to speak, not as a mullah, but
so they didn't jail him. They gave him a sentence, but
yeah, they defrocked him.
Yeah.
So he's not a mullah anymore. And they do persecute. They have a special court for the clergy, and they are trying to control. But it seems that they are losing the control of their own seminaries that they are financing.
And this is a source of your, I would call it guarded optimism. You think that the Iranian people, large swaths of them, are no longer supportive of this regime. What's going to happen, or what needs to happen to get out of this mess?
So I think we have reached the point of non-return for the legitimacy of the regime. This regime has lost complete legitimacy. Now their own the pure violence and terror are the main axis of their interaction with their civil society and their lies. So their lies are not believed anymore. Pure violence is what is hampering the society's activists, civil rights activists, to organize. So there are now, really, we have two issues. One is during all this massive expropriation, when Khomeini mobilized the lower classes, the poor, to his cause, but gave them property. They, farmers who took the lands of their bosses and expropriated them. There is a whole social segment of the society who don't know what will happen to them if things change, and this is what frighten them for change. So I think the opposition and those who want change needs to come up with a solution for that. But also, we have 300,000 Revolutionary Guards. We have many 100,000 Basijis, which are the militias. These people have advantages in the university. They have a lot of finance, and these are those who the arms of this pure violence that is exerted over the society. We need to help these people to defect, and for that we need to be clever. These are the two big issues. How to win the remaining supporters of the regime who don't believe in it anymore, but if we propose them a way out, might join the society, and then that will help us diminish the intensity of the violence. In 3 days, in 4 days, they killed 1,500 demonstrators. And, this is
And that
really
was in
frightening.
2017?
No, this
more?
was in
Just
November.
recently?
In November, uprising for the rise of gas price.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that you and I agree on in terms of helping is that the one thing we know we can do is tell the story and make sure that more and more people understand. I think Americans, if you watch this, you just learned a lot that I certainly didn't know. Your foundation, the whole mission, and the reason that is it primarily Farsi, or is it both English?
No, it's both. Everything is bilingual.
Yeah. But you are speaking to the people of Iran as much
yes,
as
to
anybody.
the people of world. So we had two objectives. One is helping the Iranian people, basically bringing the world to the Iranian people and bringing the Iranian people to the world.
Yeah.
That was our.
So how do we find your work if we want to learn more?
So if you want to learn more, you go to our website, www.iranrights.org, and we have a library. We have testimonies. You have the stories of the memorial, and we have a database that gathers all the other organizations' reports on human rights violations in Iran. We will upload also my recent articles on the library very soon.
Yes, and I was going to say that for anybody interested, I will share your brand new article in the Journal of Democracy entitled "Iranians Turn Away from the Islamic Republic." I thought it was a fantastic overview of everything we just talked about. And I really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully you'll join us again, because I feel like there's 1,000 other things to talk about.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.